Good afternoon. Welcome to our third accountability and performance meeting. For the benefit of members of the public present, I'm Jonathan Ash-Edwards, Police and Crime Commissioner for Hertfordshire. I'm joined by Charlie Hall, Chief Constable of Hertfordshire. I'll just briefly explain the purpose of these meetings and what we're going to be covering in the agenda this afternoon. So Police and Crime Commissioners have a statutory duty to hold the Chief Constable to account for the Constabulary's performance. And so I've made the decision to do that via a publicly accessible meeting. It's a viewable meeting for the public. There's no facility for members of the public to take part, but you're very welcome, and a recording of the meeting will be made available on the PCC's website shortly after. This meeting is designed to be strategic in nature, and so it doesn't cover individual cases or anything that wouldn't be appropriate to go into or is an operational matter for the Constabulary. The agenda items today, firstly, we'll do them in this order. Firstly, knife crime, personal robbery, e-scooters, stop and search, and use of force and body-worn video. So we'll start with knife crime then, and important to say at the outset really that Hertfordshire has a very low rate of violent crime in England, but for knife crime we sit a bit more sort of average in the national position. It is something that does cause some concern in some communities, and there's obviously an upcoming implementation of some new legislation around bans of zombie-style knives and machetes, which I think will be very welcome as that comes in. Perhaps I could just start by asking for a bit of an overview in terms of the Constabulary's approach to tackling knife crime, what the current trends are in terms of offences and outcome rates.
Okay, thanks very much. I think I'll start off just by describing what we mean by knife crime within this, because there's no offence as such on knife crime. What we do is we recognise that knives and sharp instruments may be part of committing other criminal offences, be that assaults in domestic abuse situations, possession of weapons, maybe robbery. So we look across our basket of crime and pick out those where a knife or sharp instrument has been seen or referenced, and we then count those as being connected with knives or other sharp instruments within that. And I, of course, recognise that there's real concern around this, and we hear a lot about it through the media on a regular basis, the length and breadth of the country. So when we do that, when we analyse our systems and look for those indicators where knives and or sharply pointed instruments are referenced, what we actually see is over the last 5 years or so, there's been a steady decline in the number of those, which I think is reassuring in terms of what we're recording. And there's over about the last 5 years, that's roughly a 35% reduction in the number of such crimes that are referenced in that way. We've also done some work, because we do have access to data that the NHS produce around admissions into hospital that seem to be connected with knife or sharply pointed instruments that have caused injury requiring hospital admission. And that data in the last 12 months sort of backs up what I've just described, because that shows a 25% reduction in hospital admissions in Hertfordshire for those. And that broadly correlates with what we're showing at the moment of around about 20% reduction over the last 12 months in those incidents. However, they're still far too high. We completely accept that, and obviously we want to bear down on it. So one of the key things we do, we've got a serious violence strategy which is agreed with a number of partners across the county to bear down on this issue. That's presently being reviewed and will be refreshed again in the next few months coming forwards. We run proactive operations across the county in responding to intelligence that we would see. We would certainly use stop and search activity where we feel that intelligence is necessary. And on occasions, we would use our Section 60 powers, which allows for people to be stopped within a certain area for a limited time period if there's particular intelligence that knives are likely to be used within that. We've had knife amnesties that we run, and very recently, in the last month, we've done that, and we've had 6 knives surrendered as a result of that work as well. And certainly on a regular basis on our briefing material out to officers, we are briefing in about individuals who we believe may be carrying knives and encouraging them to take appropriate action in that regard. So broadly overall, the number of crimes we're recording where knives and sharply pointed instruments are referenced is reducing. But we absolutely recognise the concern around that. And in terms of our outcomes, we continue to bear down on those and are looking to bring people to justice wherever we can in that regard.
Thank you. That's really useful. And how do you feel that will be able to be sustained in terms of that overall trend? And is that more of the same in terms of some of the approaches that have been successful so far? What's the feeling around sustaining that?
Well, clearly this is an area where there's often new legislation comes in, and we'll talk about some legislation that's due to come in next week, which hopefully will help with this. So ensuring that people can't have access to some of the weapons that we sometimes recover on the street is really important within that. We're being really rigorous around our hotspot patrols and identifying the areas where we may see some of these crimes take place on the street. Not all of them are on the street, so many of what I've referred to in here would include, for example, domestic abuse incidents that may have taken place in the home. But where we've got clear hotspot locations in public areas, we use the intelligence to patrol and target those. And then we have a very rigorous preventative regime that we've got in place around knife crime as well, which I'm happy to go on and talk about and describe what we do in that space. But that importantly needs to include action with other organisations and partners as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. I'll come on to the forensic work in just a moment. The final question then on this first bit is around the positive outcome rate for stop and search. We'll come back to stop and search broadly later. Is up in terms of weapons, and I think it's the highest it's been for about 4 years. How has that activity helped in this area? It certainly suggests what you're saying around some of that targeting and hotspots work is paying dividends. Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, so we stop and search is an important tool. I recognise that it needs to be used carefully and appropriately, but very much I do take the approach that I encourage officers to use it where it is necessary and appropriate, because it's for crimes such as these, it is a powerful tool for us to do that. We increasingly try to get more surgical, for want of a better word, in how we do that, ensure we've got good intelligence, we're briefing that out. And I think that increasing positive outcome rate is indicating that where we've got the intelligence, we ensure officers have it. We know the locations, the individuals that they may be looking for, and certainly officers are encouraged where they need to get out and use those powers. And what we're seeing is coming through, and we will continue to look to take knives and weapons off the street because we recognise the damage that they can cause.
Thank you. That's reassuring to hear. Touching then on the preventative work and recognising this is not just a matter for policing, but a range of services and agencies. What part of the preventative work with young people in particular who are carrying knives or at risk of doing so is done by the Constabulary? What sort of outcomes are being seen through that?
Sure. So I've been here a little while now, and in 2018, I remember being concerned by some of the knife crime incidents that we'd had. So we took a very deliberate preventative approach, established a schools young persons team, and they were particularly tasked with targeting these issues for us, and that was woven into our serious violence strategy very strongly. So since then, there's a number of approaches that they take. There's some general inputs that they and some of our neighbourhood teams provide into pretty much all the schools across the county, including in primary schools where we run our mini police scheme, where we do a very tailored across, and they are increasingly being used, and particularly into some schools where we feel the need is greater to do that. And then beyond that, the specialist team of officers that I've got, we run something called Op Habitual, which is using the intelligence that we know about the referrals that we get in from other agencies about young people who we feel are habitual knife carriers, and we target a really intensive programme working alongside the youth service, for example, to meet and seek to educate, disrupt these individuals and move them away from a culture of feeling the need to carry knives. And that programme's been running for some considerable time now. Presently, we've got 29 individuals on that programme. Each month we look at the list and some come off that and others go on to that. Not all of them engage ever so effectively with us, if I'm honest. So the team works really hard at trying to improve the engagement, but they absolutely do not give up on that. But we are effectively all over them, and where necessary, if they continue to carry knives and we are able to prosecute them for that, then we'll look to put criminal behaviour orders wrapped around them to help control that. And in part, the fact they are carrying knives means that they are themselves at risk as well as presenting risks to other people. And I'm actually quite proud of the work that we've done in that regard. And I've talked about how the actual trend in knife crime has been coming down for 5 years, and I think the preventative programme we've had in place and both the general nature of that, but then particularly the way that's been targeted at specific cohorts that are most at risk, has in part, I think there's no insignificant part been responsible for helping that rate come down.
Thank you. I've certainly seen some of those initiatives, certainly the virtual reality one, were very, very impactful with the group of young people that I saw that being done with in terms of some of those choices and decisions, as you said. So it's really, really good to see that happening in practice. For the sort of more habitual group, how's the success of that programme measured? Is that in terms of young people engaging and then coming off? Is it around what kind of measurements around them stopping, carrying? What does success look like and how's it measured?
Yeah, I think ultimately it's the number of knife crime incidents that we're having across the county. I think one of the successes is that we have had more and more people referred into that program. So it's recognised by not only police officers and colleagues, but also other agencies. It's an important programme to get on there. The reoffending rates are difficult to pick up on, to be honest, but anecdotally the team are reporting there's not everybody on that programme, but a reasonable number. They are confident they are changing the behaviour of those individuals, helping them to realise the risks involved in what they have been doing, sometimes being able to break away from people they are associated with and set their lives off on a different path. Probably right, we probably do with a more in-depth evaluation. We may need to think about whether we get some academic partners to work with us to give us some more empirical data.
There's clearly confidence that
Yes.
that it is having an impact and that it's a program that partners are finding. So that's a good place to be, for the sounds of it. Thank you. So we've touched a little bit then on the ban on zombie-style knives, so-called, and machetes coming into force next week, and you mentioned the amnesty that's currently in place. How's the Constabulary planning to respond to that ban coming into place? How much of a change will it drive for the Constabulary?
So the ban is for zombie-style knives and machetes and things from next Tuesday. I think it is 24th of September when it comes into place. So that will ban owning, possessing, buying such knives. So ahead of that, we've been running taking part in the national amnesty. No questions asked, come and hand them in. Let's collect as many of these weapons out there as we can off the streets. We've had over 60 handed in within that period. Beyond Tuesday of next week, we're now working up briefings for all the officers, so they're really clear that the ban is in force, what it means, which sorts of knives are covered by that. That will be briefed out to all our frontline officers and staff. And then beyond that, we're working in a training package for officers as well. And there's also work going on across partners as well, because some of the enforcement proactivity around these bans, particularly around the sale, is for other partners, particularly local authorities, training standards, to get engaged with as well. And we are working with them to ensure there's join up around the legislation, and that it's not just legislation that sits on the statute book, but we are prepared to use it. We do indeed use it going forward, because, frankly, these are being banned for a reason. Nobody has a legitimate reason to need these knives, and they are especially dangerous, and we need to get them off the streets and out of possession. Absolutely.
Thank you. And useful to just pick up on the sort of retail and sale perspective, because obviously stopping them at sources is a key part of this. Are you satisfied so far with that wider response in terms of stopping the supply at source, or is that still a bit of a work in progress ahead of next week?
I think the source of these is often online, and so whilst we can talk about the work that we're doing in Hertfordshire around that, it requires a wider national effort and dealing with those online retailers. From what I can see, that work has been taking place. And there are clearly some sellers who have properly engaged with the scheme. There's a compensation scheme as well that the government have run around this, and definitely some sellers have been involved. I think we probably will need to see after Tuesday of next week whether that's had the far-reaching effect we really need it to. And the important thing is that both ourselves and other partners in this enforcement space are able to move quickly and address any sellers that have not engaged and done what they should be around these weapons.
Okay, thank you. We'll look forward to seeing the impact of that coming into place next week. I'm going to move on then to our second agenda item, which is personal robbery. Where again, context important in terms of figures being low, but in some hotspots in the county, there's been some increases this year over the last few months. Can I ask about those then, in terms of the sort of current trends of offences and the Constabulary's approach to addressing some of those concerns about personal robbery?
Sure. I think probably start with this. There's quite a lot going on in the data here, ups and downs and different movement, which can be a bit difficult to track. But if I generally start with, again, over the last 5 years, certainly as we've come out from COVID, the trend in robbery offences is downwards, and it's a pleasing trend, and it's quite a sharp downward trend generally over that 5-year period. And when I talk about robbery, we then split the classification of robbery into two broad areas. One is what we term business robbery, and which is where the offence of robbery, and the offence of robbery is where someone uses or threatens violence in order to steal, would be. And so we talk about business robbery, which would be targeted towards businesses, usually shops, retail premises, most likely around that. And then the second one is what we would describe as personal robbery, which is targeted towards individuals. And they're probably more likely to happen in the street or the park or somewhere like that. Just going to touch briefly on the business robbery side, because around business robbery, if you look at our figures, it looks like a really significant increase in that. And that is almost exclusively because we've changed the way we're recording some of these offences as a result of some national changes. And it means that more of what we would previously recorded as shop theft, because there's been some words exchanged in order to get away. We're now classifying those as robbery offences, which previously we would not have done. So that's made the figures look different. On the personal robbery side, as I say, the long-term trend has been downwards, but we've got that a little bit in over the summer. And we've actually seen some increases in personal robbery since April. So we've actually recorded year to date since April another 63 offences more than we had over the same period of last year. And we're up to 360 offences thereabouts. So it's roughly a 20% increase that we've seen. That's obviously a concern for us, and we do look very closely at where these robberies are taking place. They are more likely to occur after 6 p.m. at night, into the evening, maybe the early hours of the morning. They tend to be on the street or in park locations, and often are in order to steal either mobile phones or cash is the most usual thing that we see that's targeted through there. We've had a few areas across the county where we've seen particular hotspots. Watford and to a lesser extent St Albans have been those areas, and we've put proactive operations on the back of that kind of target. Those to bring those numbers down. And in terms of the outcomes that we are seeing, in terms of the positive outcomes, we've detected just about 5 offences less than we've detected over the same period last year. So we still need to target into some of these and bring these people to justice.
Thank you, and really helpful clarification in terms of some of those differences around the crime types, which is giving some better understanding, I think, of some of those offences. Particularly, just drilling a little bit around some of the hotspots, because I think it is important to say is something that is a bit hotspot linked. How does the Constabulary identify those hotspots and kind of respond in terms of that understanding of, okay, there is a pattern of activity here that we now need to respond to in terms of that kind of understanding of data and reports?
Yeah, so I have a team of staff, and they're a mixture of police officers and police staff who sit within the intelligence teams. It includes analysts who look at the crime data coming through, and on a day-to-day basis they are analysing the crime patterns, the data that we're seeing, what we're hearing from communities, what intelligence is being submitted by the officers, and they put all of that together to understand where that is. The hotspots themselves are effectively generated predominantly through the crime recording data that we get through. They will also have access to the incidents that get called into our control room, so we'll be able to map those, and we're able to pinpoint those in different locations and draw maps effectively and start to see where where those offences are taking place. They will then do some further work to look at times of day, profile of the individuals who are victims of that, what sort of things are being stolen. And through that work, we can often link offences together because whilst I've talked about the numbers, the actual number of offenders involved will be smaller than that. And we know that we will have some people who are relatively prolific and are committing a number of these offences, and indeed the hotspot that we've seen in St Albans I described, most of that was contributed to on one evening where an individual decided to, in this case, stop several vehicles and threaten the occupants in order to steal from those vehicles. So we do absolutely need to get behind the data and understand exactly what's going on at those times, and then we can put together our proactive operations accordingly so that we stand the best chance of intervening with them.
Thank you. And I know there's been some of that work done in Watford, again, particularly around some of the parks in the town centre that have been a concern over the summer. I know has been responding to some of those community concerns. I want to just touch on around some of the victim profile, because some of that sort of street level personal robbery appears to particularly impact young people. A significant proportion of victims are under the age of 24, and in particular, vast bulk of those are boys and young men. Do you have a feeling around what steps can be taken in terms of some of the sort of prevention and safeguarding work around those sorts of members of our community who are more likely to be targeted perhaps by some of those offenders?
Sure, I think it might be helpful to say, as I said at the start, the definition of robbery is where violence is used or threatened to be used in order to steal. In the vast majority of the cases we are recording, that relates to violence is threatened and not actually used. So the actual use of violence is far smaller within this cohort than the threat of violence. Some of those threats and some of these incidents will involve school-age individuals threatening one another. We would record that as robbery. Very, very few of these would involve people, for example, having knives held at their throat. But we do work with our PCSOs, will be in our hotspot areas. So Casbury Park would be an example with vehicle control plans. They're encouraged to speak to young people to both glean what they might understand about what's going on and help us to identify offenders in those locations. We will be further into the schools providing advice. We will look to be very visible. We also work closely with British Transport Police and other police forces where we feel that some of these offenders are travelling in from elsewhere to help target them on those locations as well. And we definitely circulate leaflets, crime prevention advice to any groups that we think may be particularly susceptible to being victims of crime, to try and ensure that they reduce the likelihood that they will be.
Okay, thank you. That was helpful. I'm going to move on to our next agenda item about e-scooters, which is primarily on the agenda because it has driven probably the largest amount of correspondence into the office over recent months compared to any other topic. And as particularly sort of community concerns from residents about the use of e-scooters in town centres, into particular concerns from blind people, people with disabilities around the kind of impact of people whizzing around town centres on these e-scooters. I suppose really just to start off with, it'd be useful just to have some clarity around what the legal position of these e-scooters is and kind of what the policing response to that is.
I think it probably is a place to start because it's it's a bit of a complex area around e-scooters. So, and the legislative position potentially is going to be changing moving forwards as well, as we know. It's not unlawful to sell e-scooters. So the sale of them is not an issue. And we know there are many retailers that are selling e-scooters. Broadly, e-scooters can only be used on private land or private property. They are not lawfully available to be used on public roads, pavements, or other pedestrian areas. Broadly, the reason for that is an e-scooter is something called a mechanically propelled vehicle. It then has its own propulsion system. And in order to use if you use a mechanically propelled vehicle on the road, effectively it comes classified as a motor vehicle. And you can only lawfully use a motor vehicle on the road if it fits certain criteria, and that will include it need to be insured, it will need to be taxed, it will need to have passed certain safety testing regimes that are outlined by the Department for Transport, and there is no such regime in place, as I understand it, to enable e-scooters to meet the criteria that is set out to be able to use a motor vehicle on a road. So it's, as a result of that, it is unlawful to use e-scooters on a public road. I say that with some slight caution because there are a handful of places around the country that have an exemption to that, where there are some pilot schemes to enable the use of e-scooters. None of those are in Hertfordshire. I believe it's about 30 locations. There's a few bits of London and other parts of the country. And in those locations, you are able to use e-scooters provided they are hired through an approved scheme. So you can't use your own privately purchased e-scooter, but you can if you go through the approved places where you can hire them in those limited locations. You are able to use that on the road. So that's the legal position. As I'm sure you'll be aware, there is a lot of debate around that, and politicians certainly are involved in debating this. And that position, as I've outlined, it may well change going forwards as Parliament looks further at the issue.
Thank you. That's useful clarification. So one of the sort of common questions that sort of comes in terms of the public correspondence on this is, what are the police doing about the illegal use of these sort of e-scooters, and the feeling that they're often ridden in quite a dangerous way in public places. How has policing been able to respond to this as a fairly new product? Essentially, what are the challenges? What's the kind of general policing response?
Well, I think I'd say firstly we recognise the danger that can be created by these. That's both to the individual riding these scooters, and we have in Hertfordshire dealt with a handful of cases where people have come off these and caused quite significant injury to themselves. So that there's definitely a risk to the people riding these. But I think many members of the public would equally rightly identify the risk to other road users, or particularly pedestrians. And we've had some examples where injuries have been caused to members of the public by people riding these e-scooters as well. So we absolutely recognise the need to bear down on this. There are some practical challenges for policing in stopping somebody riding an e-scooter who has decided they don't wish to stop before police officers either on foot or on a vehicle is particularly challenging and difficult. And I think it's probably fair to say we don't have a well-developed way in order to stop these vehicles. They're clearly very manoeuvrable and can get away down alleyways and evade officers on foot or in vehicles quite easily. We will follow those up though around that, and where we do, our broad approach is to look to educate and encourage people to comply with the law in the first place, and that's we think that has some benefits and is a reasonable policing response, mostly to this. We've also worked inside schools and colleges to provide advice to help explain the legal position. And if you look on our Constabulary website, you will see that there is advice on e-scooters as to what the law says about e-scooters, the dangers associated with them. All of that is out there. We've certainly looked to target that advice into places where we know people maybe are considering using e-scooters as well. And then where that's not effective, we will seize. We've seized these vehicles, we impound them, and we've had a number destroyed on the back of that over the last couple of years around enforcing against those who continue to unlawfully use these scooters.
And that's helpful, thank you. And where that, starting with that educational position, which it's sensible, and where that perhaps then leads to more enforcement. You touched upon sort of the challenges perhaps in the moment, and sometimes they need to come back to it, which obviously sometimes a member of the public won't see. They'll see the e-scooter being ridden, won't necessarily see the policing response later. Is what you're saying that's the most effective way of an officer? First of all, someone might be riding it without an officer in the vicinity. If there is an officer in the vicinity, that actually chances are that there'll be a response later to go and intervene. Is that what we're saying is the most effective response from a policing perspective?
Yeah, I think I would be wrong if I gave the position that I've got officers all around the county chasing around after these individuals. I haven't. We will follow up on some cases, certainly. Where we know it is a particular issue, the neighbourhood teams will put problem-solving plans in place and look to deal with that and be more focused around dealing with those issues. So we've got one such plan in place in Stevenage. At present, we've had a good deal of work taking place at Bishopsthorpe as well, around particular issues with e-scooters in that way. And indeed, we've given some publicity to that. So you may have seen some of the media attention of the work that we've put in addressing e-scooters in those locations as well. This year, we've seized so far 22 e-scooters. Last year it was over 30 that were seized, and the year before that similarly 30. So we're seizing those sorts of numbers of these scooters, and they are being disposed of as a result, because they're being seized effectively because they're not insured for use on the roads, and you can't get insurance for use on the roads. And we have powers to be able to seize vehicles that are not insured, and that's how we capture these in that way. But I say it is problematic to identify sometimes the people who are using them, and some of these simply they don't stop for police officers in the way they are equally riding around people on the pavement as well. And I think ultimately it needs further support from government legislation to really make it very clear what the position is on the use of these e-scooters.
Okay, thank you. That's useful clarification, and certainly recognise some of the practical challenge for the constabulary there, but positive to hear about some of that work around seizures as well, which I appreciate sometimes members of the public might not then see happening when officers are doing those interventions. So thank you for that. I'm going to move on now to stop and search. So particularly picking up on the annual report from the independent scrutiny panel on stop and search that's administered by my office. you said earlier when we were talking about other matters, it's an important tool for policing, but with some challenges, which I think are sort of widely known and recognised. I suppose perhaps just in terms of a starting point on this one, it looks like a broadly positive direction of travel in terms of the use of stop and search in the county, improving outcome rates. Is that your general reflection around the use of these powers?
As I say, it's a really important power for us to use. I need to make sure the officers both are confident in using those powers when they need to, but also that they use them responsibly as well. And they recognise that not only are they a powerful policing tool, but they can also cause issues for those who have been stopped and searched and communities, and there is understandable concern in many communities about how we do this, so we need to make sure we use them really responsibly. We are using stop and search powers just over 500 times each month. We are using these all across the county. And as you say, what we describe as the outcome rate, so we refer to, we measure both an arrest rate, so how many of the stop and searches result in an arrest, and that at the moment is sitting at around about 20% of those, and that is an increasing rate. So that if that's a measure of success, then it's probably indicating they are being more targeted and using the intelligence effectively. And we then refer to a more positive rate, and that's currently sitting at 35%. Again, that is up from similar period a couple of years ago, and a positive outcome in that sense is where we've been able to use stop and search to substantiate some of the grounds that we had as to why the search was taking place in the first place, but they weren't necessarily always going to lead to an arrest needing to take place. All our officers are really carefully trained in how we conduct that, and that training includes understanding the impact of stop and search on individuals and on the community. And we have a very rigorous supervision regime that sits behind that, with first line supervisors being required to review stop and searches that officers take place to ensure that they fit with the procedure that's outlined. We have a mnemonic we call Go Wisely, which officers are expected to work against, which sets out a number of factors that need to be in place for a stop search to take place, and then what the officers are required to do in terms of identifying themselves, keeping records, things. So they supervise and ensure that's in place. And as you've already identified, that a number of those stop searches are pulled into your stop and search scrutiny panel that checks on those things as well. So yes, we always need to keep a really close eye on this. It's a tool we absolutely need to use, but I'm reassured that the panel and the annual report says that it's satisfied that in the vast majority of cases we are using stop and search powers appropriately.
Thank you for that, and I think that's a positive position, and I think the sort of wider context for members of the public watching is that both on the arrest and the positive outcomes figures mentioned, both of those are higher in Hertfordshire than the national averages, which very much goes to your point around that sort of informed and intelligent use of those powers. One question I wanted to ask around the positive outcome rate is that it does differ quite significantly between some of the CSPs. What is the Constabulary's reflection as to any reasons for that, and any action that is or could be taken to try and address those differences in positive outcome rates?
Yeah, so I think I've got 10 CSPs or district council areas. I think it is always going to vary. When you've got 10 of anything and you measure a rate for something, it'll be highly unlikely it's going to be identical wherever you go within that. But what we do look at the data and the trends, and I say there is supervision of all of those stops. The context in those different CSPs will look different, as well as to the locations where we are stopping people, the times and the reasons that people are being stopped. So I think that will breed some of that natural fluctuation in there. We do push this data back into our chief inspectors who are responsible for those CSPs. They are expected to scrutinise the data and ensure that their supervision is to take place, and that the intelligence flows are being very clearly communicated to the frontline officers so that they can be focused and surgical in the way that they undertake the stop search activity. As I say, broadly across the county as a whole, their outcome rates are improving, and I think my aspiration is to see that replicated across all of the CSPs so that the system of stop search we can be confident is being effective wherever you are.
Thank you. And yeah, I think only 1 of 10 CSPs has an outcome rate below the national average, and most of them are significantly above. So, so that's certainly a positive position. You've referenced a couple of times in the meeting, the importance of the powers. Can you talk me through a bit more what steps the Constabulary is taking to ensure that officers do feel confident and supported in using those powers when they feel that it's justified and necessary to try and disrupt crime or weapons or drugs possessions or whatever it might be?
Yeah, so we've all officers are trained in this, and we've got a system of refresher training that is being put into officers to help give them that confidence. And I have to say, most officers, a successful stop search where you are acting on intelligence and find something based on that intelligence, it might be a knife, as we were talking about earlier, and able to make an arrest from that is pretty satisfying for officers because they feel they are using proactive powers in a really focused, targeted way and getting a result. And most officers, feel that is a really successful deployment of policing powers. So clearly, we want to encourage them to use that, but we also need to ensure that they understand why stop search can be divisive in some communities, and what it can feel like to be stopped and searched as well if you are the individual subject to that. So part of the training is to ensure that they are able to reflect on that as well. And we've got a video we used of an individual who has been stopped and searched in Hertfordshire, who is able to describe their experience as to what that feels like. And on the back of that, we encourage officers to discuss why that person might be feeling that way, how the stop and search encounter could be conducted in a way that minimises that feeling, how we can ensure that a stop and search that is taking place in a public environment can be made as discreet, private and sensitive for the individual being stop and searched as possible. And we certainly encourage our officers to conduct them in that way. And then our supervisors are, as I've described, expected to help supervise around that and give feedback to the officers, encourage them to improve their stop and search practice. And indeed, I think that's where the stop and search scrutiny panel is so valuable as well, because there is feedback that comes back from that panel as well that we then use to feedback into supervisors themselves and indeed the individual officers as to how that encounter is perceived. I think the other thing that we do is it is expected that officers are recording the encounter on their body-worn video as well. So officers are fully expected to activate the body-worn video so that all of that interaction is captured on the body-worn video, and it provides an excellent tool by which to review those encounters.
Thank you, and I know the panel very much welcomes that interaction with the Constabulary in terms of that scrutiny, and has found it useful. To pick up on that sort of broader point in terms of the impact of the use of those powers, there's been quite a lot of work done in Hertfordshire around the disproportionality of stop and search. Some research commissioned from the University of Hertfordshire published earlier in the year on that. And the data broadly shows that the level of disproportionality in Hertfordshire is lower than in other forces in the most similar force group, but nonetheless there is some still existing there. Can you talk me through, and some of it probably goes to some of the points you've already made, in terms of the intelligence and training and things, but what the Constabulary is continuing to do to reduce the stop and search disproportionality and demonstrate that those powers aren't used in a discriminatory way?
So you're right. Our data and the research that's been done shows that there is still disproportionality in the way that stop and search is conducted across Hertfordshire. Most pronounced in terms of black people, which shows it's about 4.6 times more likely to be stop and search than members from the white community. We do in the training, there's a big focus on disproportionality, and the key thing is absolutely ensuring that the grounds are completely objective around that stop and search, and then they're not formed by other factors within that. We emphasise that a great deal. We're also helped in this way through work that we do against the Police Race Action Plan, which is a national action plan, and we are very focused on delivering that in the county as well. And we are assisted in that regard by a Race Inclusion Board, which is made up by members of the community volunteers who come in to help us and scrutinise us around that. That meets on a monthly basis, and it regularly looks into the stop search data and the issue, and we talk to them a great deal about the work that we are doing around stop and search, the training that's being given to officers, and we do have members on that board themselves who have been stopped and searched, who would be within the communities that we disproportionately, our data shows that they're disproportionately likely to be stopped and searched, and that's a really rich and valuable discussion for us to have with those communities. And the key thing, I think, is making sure our processes as to how we develop the intelligence is as far as we can possibly make it free from racial bias, and then the officers themselves absolutely understand why, if they are conducting a stop search, why they are conducting that stop search, and they can completely be objective to the reasons why around that. And we will continue to work to try and pull the disproportionality down.
Thank you very much for that, and I know that the scrutiny panel will continue doing its work on that. I want to then just touch on a final aspect, again, an incredibly sensitive aspect around the strip searching of under 18s. There's been a recent report by the Children's Commissioner for England around the use of these powers by police forces across the country following events a few years ago in London. And there's quite a bit of scrutiny around this area. Perhaps could I just ask around what circumstances where would result in these kinds of powers being used, and what processes are in place to ensure that it is only in strictly exceptional and justified circumstances where such a search of an under 18 would be used, and what safeguarding protections are put around the search.
Okay, so there are powers to strip search anybody effectively where we feel it is really necessary for their own or another's safety, or because they have items concealed about them that are perhaps evidential in nature, and that would usually probably be drugs or weapons. It's generally what we would, why we would strip search individuals around that. It's really important we use this only in exceptional cases where other means of searching have failed to satisfy us. We've got some very clear intelligence that individuals have such items with them. And it's important that where we do that, it's done exceptionally sensitively. It's done very clearly out of public view, or in premises, and it is even more sensitive around under 18s. We absolutely recognise that. So we have focused in the last few years. We've tightened up our policy and procedure around this, and it really would only take place in our custody environment involving children. And we've been very clear that before such a strip search could be authorised, we require an inspector to have reviewed fully the circumstances, exhausted the opportunities to satisfy the objective of that search in any other way, and has formally made a written record of why he or she is authorising such a strip search to take place. And then around that, we also require other safeguards to be put in place. With that, only with people of the same gender, no more than 2 adults present, one of whom should be an appropriate adult to represent the child's interests in that space. Ideally, I want to be able to reduce the number of these that we do to 0. I think that the aspiration should be we must get to a point where we never have to conduct any such invasive strip searches of these. At the moment, we are on average doing about 1 such under 18 strip search per month. And most of those will be individuals who are pretty close to their 18th birthday anyway, 15, 16, 17 year olds, but it'll be predominantly done to ensure their own safety or the safety of others who are around them, around that. So I think so far in the last 12 months, there's been about 10 of these occasions that we've done that. And if you look at the Children's Commissioner report, that's pretty much at the level that other forces are conducting these searches as well.
Thank you for that, and reassuring to hear some of the safeguards put in place there, and where such a search is made, that is automatically reviewed, I think, by the scrutiny panel to look at, as you say, some of the authorising inspectors' justification and documentation on that. That's useful reassurance. Thank you. I'm going to move on now to use of force and body-worn video, again, sort of subject to some recent annual reports from those scrutiny panels. And so if I could just start by asking for your sort of general reflections on both of those areas. Use of force, sometimes necessary by officers in the discharge of their duty, but again needs to be used appropriately and lawfully, and then in quite a lot of scrutiny in Hertfordshire in recent times around how body-worn video is used. So perhaps if I could start by just getting your reflections around the use of those powers and tools over the last
year. Well, use of force is obviously necessary in policing, and we use force in a number of different ways. What we do is look to record when force is used to ensure that we can be transparent, we can describe how often we've used force, and enable it to be opened up to supervision and scrutiny as you describe. And similarly, body-worn video is a slightly different thing. All our frontline officers are equipped with body-worn video, and we encourage them to use it, turn that on. Certainly in use of force cases, in stop and search cases, when arrests are being made or when there's evidence to be collated. And it's important that that is scrutinised as well. And I'm pleased that your annual reports showing both use of force and body-worn video cases that the Constabulary is pretty compliant. They're not identifying any serious concerns in the way we do that. That said, of the cases they look at, there is some feedback that is given, and we look to act on that. But mostly, I think the scrutiny is showing our compliance levels are generally pretty good. And where there is learning, we take that away and reflect that.
Thank you. That's certainly the case, and probably the one main area to just pick up on is around body-worn video. One of the things that the scrutiny panel has highlighted is that in quite a reasonable proportion of the incidents that it reviews, which obviously is only a sample, officers are not always informing members of the public that the body-worn video is on, that's being recorded, and that's something that the standard operating procedure requires to happen. So what's the Constabulary doing to improve compliance with that aspect of policy?
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, pleasing, when I looked at the body-worn video, we've talked about stop search already. We do ask officers to record that, and virtually 98% of cases the panel has found that body-worn video is on, which is pleasing. It's certainly a far improved position than would have been a few years ago with that. As you say, when we are using body-worn video, officers are required to inform members of the public that the video is on and recording. That's not always taking place. The equipment itself does have a little flashing light on it, but not all members of the public will recognise that is the case in there. Of course, that video recording is there to ensure that an accurate record is made of that interaction, both to protect the member of the public and also the officer themselves in that way. So what we do from the findings from the scrutiny panel, we take them away and then we reflect them back into policy, back into briefings, back into communications that we give with officers. Some of that gets picked up very quickly by officers. Some things, and I fear this might be one of them, is one that we're going to have to continue to reiterate with officers. They should all already know that they are required to do this. And I think sometimes, given the situation that they are in, sometimes they are needing to look out for many things, their own safety, the safety of other individuals. Some of these situations can be quite challenging and at times heated. And I fear this is often one thing that they overlook as a result of that, but we will continue to work with them, feed them back in to advise them that they need to be saying this. And hopefully we will see that picture improve over the next 12 months, that more often than not, we will find officers are advising that the body-worn video is running.
Thank you. And as you say, there is a light on it, and it makes a noise when it's being turned on, doesn't it? So there is that sort of technological part of it, but as you say, that aspect of the policy is being pursued as well. A final question on that, really. Body-worn video is now well established in policing, and as you say, some quite significant benefits for it in terms of both the member of the public and the officer's position. What's the Constabulary learned from its use and its kind of widespread involvement in interactions between officers and members of the public? Generally, is that something officers have found helpful as a development over time?
I think when we first introduced it, it was a challenge at times to have officers turn the body-worn video on, and it is not running all the time, and there's some good reasons as to why it's not running all the time. Some technical reasons. One is the battery life on the equipment would not enable it to run for a full 8 to 10 hour shift. So that needs to be done. We store the imagery that comes off the body-worn video on our systems, and it would generate an enormous storage requirement for us, and it would be storing, frankly, a lot of mundane interactions and footage that is never likely to be evidentially used. So that's another reason I'd store it. And also in terms of privacy and sensitivity, there are some interactions that's clearly not appropriate to record on body-worn video, and also the individual privacy of the officers. That said, now I think the position's changed round, and officers absolutely embrace this because they see how valuable it is. One, in being able to produce evidence to court of things that they've been involved with. It certainly helps them. It often helps deal with complaints that may be made against officers as well, and very often by quickly reviewing that body-worn video footage can either substantiate or more often negate actually the complaints that are being levelled against officers, and are able to demonstrate that the officer actually has behaved pretty reasonably, often under quite provocation from members of the public around that. But in some instances, it's also been used to actually demonstrate that the complaint should be upheld. And I chair a number of misconduct hearings, and in some of those body-worn video footage have actually been pretty valuable and important in being able to demonstrate the officers have not acted appropriately and fairly, and in a small number of cases that had led to dismissal of officers. So I think it's got really wide use through that. One of the things we've done recently is improve the technology such that when our officers turn their body-worn video on and they recognise they're in a situation that needs recording, and often that's as a result of something that has just happened, perhaps an interaction on the street. The body-worn video footage now effectively is already recording the 30 seconds prior to the activation of the camera. So we don't now just get the footage from the point at which the officer presses the button, but it's also pre-recorded the 30 seconds prior to that, so that we've got that recording as well, which is really, really useful.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to close this afternoon's meeting there. I'd like to thank members of the public who've joined to observe. The recording and summary of the meeting will be published in due course. And Chief Constable.